So let's read 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 and the first 4 verses. For yourselves, brethren, know our entrance in unto you, that it was not in vain. But even after that we had suffered before, and were shamefully entreated, as ye know, at Philippi, we were bold in our God to speak unto you the gospel of God with much contention. For our exhortation was not of deceit, nor of uncleanness, nor in guile. But as we were allowed of God to be put in trust with the gospel, even so we speak, not as pleasing men, but God which trieth our hearts. Most of us like to please. There is the odd curmudgeon who only seems happy when they annoy people, but most of us would rather get approval for what we do. At the same time, we have all discovered that it just isn't possible to please everyone, no matter how hard you try. You might be able to please some of the people some of the time, but you can't please all of the people all of the time. So, who should we please? Paul provides a touchstone in these verses. Verse 4, not as pleasing men, but God. In chapter 4, he reminds the Thessalonians that ye ought to please God. And in 2 Timothy chapter 2, he wrote that a Christian should please him who hath chosen him to be a soldier. Pleasing God ought to be our focus. Later in this chapter, he writes about those who please not God, verse 15. That is certainly not a good place to be. Unfortunately, too often we do what pleases ourselves. That's the spirit of the age in which we live. Do what suits you. If we were honest, we might just recognise that in ourselves. Yet it is completely foreign to the Bible. Paul wrote in Romans chapter 15 that we ought not to please ourselves. And he highlighted the example of the Lord Jesus. Even Christ pleased not himself, verse 3 of that chapter. So that's clear enough. But then Paul also wrote in Romans 15 that every one of us ought to please his neighbour for his good. Having a heart for others and a desire for the good of others is a hallmark of Christian living. Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians 10 at the end of the chapter about how he sought to please all men in all things, not seeking my own profit. But here's the rub. What if pleasing men collides with pleasing God? Paul had plenty of experiences where that was the case. And this is what he wrote in Galatians chapter 1. If I yet pleased men, I should not be the servant of Christ. In other words, if pleasing men was my goal rather than pleasing God, I would be denying my calling. Nothing should trump pleasing God in our lives. If we achieve that, we will bring blessing to others and joy to our own hearts. And that was what Paul was doing in these first verses of this chapter. Paul did not go to Greece for a holiday in the sun as we might. He was shamefully entreated at Philippi, verse 2. And he had much contention in Thessalonica, the same verse. He used neither deceit, uncleanness, nor guile, verse 3, to gain a following for himself. God had put him in trust with the gospel, verse 4, and he wanted to fulfill that obligation in a way that would please his God, come what may. I just wonder how clear and objective is that in my way of living. In the next video, we'll think about how freely Paul put himself at the disposal of the Christians.